So what we're going to talk about today is the redistricting that's being done at the state level. And so just to clarify, the county, the city, and the school board all do redistricting. But today what we're going to talk about is redistricting that's being done at the state level. And so the redistricting at the state level is developing districts for congressional representatives, which are the people that represent us in the House of Representatives, the US House of Representatives, and also our Florida senators and Florida representatives. So for example, Kat Cammack, Keith Perry, and depending on where you live in Alachua County, Yvonne Hinson or Chuck Clemens. So those are the level at which we're talking about redistricting. A district determines who can run and who can vote. So when you set up a district, you have to live in that district to run for office, and the only people that can vote for that office are the people that live in that district. So at the end of the redistricting process, which happens every 10 years, after the census data is reported, we end up with maps describing each district. Those maps are determining districts for the next 10 years. So they'll start in November 2022 and they'll go until November of 31. So it's a very big deal. Redistricting determines who you can vote for the next 10 years. Next slide.
Yeah, it is. It's a really big deal.
Yeah. And I think if you have questions, if you want to hold them to the end, so that I promised Jeff I would get through this pretty quickly. So Congress, so the U.S. House of Representatives, the U.S. House of Representatives has 435 seats, and they're distributed according to population throughout the state. And so again, every 10 years, they look at, the census people look at how many people are in the state, how many representatives you have, and if necessary, redistribute the number of representatives that you have based on the updated population data. Since a lot of people are moving to Florida away from the north and northeast, we had 27 up till now. Now we have 28 seats in the House of Representatives. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the way that it works for the congressional districts is the Florida House. Okay, so all the districts are drawn by the legislature. All of the districts that we're talking about, all the state districts are drawn by the Florida legislature and will be drawn during this session. So for the congressional districts, both the House and the Senate draw a map, and then when they both have their maps, they get together and they have to agree on a single map. Once they agree on that, it goes to the governor, and this used to be this next sentence used to be perfunctory, but maybe not so much right now, that the governor approves the maps, and then you have your congressional districts, which are set, and people are anxious to get this process over with because you have to file to run by the end of April. So people want to know which districts, where the districts are, because it'll determine whether they can run. And of course, if they're going to run, they need to start collecting money and establishing a campaign. So people like to get these things done expeditiously. Next slide, please. So the legislative districts, now we're talking about the Florida House and the Florida Senate. They each draw their own district maps. Then they're approved, and those are parallel processes. They don't really intersect at any point. Then they're reviewed by the Attorney General, who has 15 days to review them, and then it's submitted to the Supreme Court, the Florida Supreme Court, for review. And if it's accepted, then they're established as maps. And if they're not accepted, or they can't get it done by the end of the session, then they have to have a special session at the end of this one, after this one, to draw some final maps. And again, the candidates are anxious to get this process completed because they have to file to run in the middle of June. Next slide, please. So if you've heard anything about districts, you've probably heard the concern about gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is essentially drawing districts to favor one party or another. And informally, the way people describe that is that the lawmakers are choosing their voters instead of the voters choosing their lawmakers. And many states, like Florida, the legislators draw their own maps. So it's a little bit like the fox watching the hen house, because they have power to control the maps that then have a lot to do with whether they are running or not running or eligible to run. So it's sort of a dicey situation, and has evolved over time, that needing a lot of oversight. Some states like California actually have independent commissions that draw the districts, but we are not one of those. Just an example of how that can impact the voters' ability to control the policies in their state. North Carolina, we're a little bit later than most states. Most states have actually completed their redistricting. North Carolina can control 71% of their congressional seats with 40% of the popular vote because of gerrymandering. And Texas, these are just two specific examples from the Brennan Center, which is a voting policy group. Texas would have to win 58% of the vote to win 37% of the Congress, just to give you an example of how dramatic it can be. So next slide, please. So when this process began, there was a lot of concern. In the 2010 redistricting process was very traumatic, very contentious, ended up with lots of lawsuits. The lawsuits were not, the decisions weren't made until 2015. And so there was a lot of anxiety about this process, particularly among Democrats and fair district people like the League of Women Voters. So typically before a session begins, the legislators go around the state and they have these town halls and they accept a lot of in-person testimony. But because of COVID this year, they said they weren't going to do that, which is fine, but they also didn't take any remote verbal input either. I mean, obviously nowadays we're all used to having virtual meetings. So they did not have any virtual meetings ahead of time. So there was a lot of concern expressed about that. The only ways that citizen input can be submitted is that there's a website and you can submit written testimony through the website, and I'll give you that address toward the end. And then during the session, you could drive up there and give a 2 to 3 minute testimony. But as you probably have read, there are no COVID protections in that whole Capitol complex. So I was tempted, but even if you wear a mask, I mean, nobody else was wearing a mask, so pretty dicey. So, and I bring this up here in terms of transparency of the process, because I think it's important, especially as we get a little bit further along in the presentation. But you probably know that Florida has a very broad open records law. It's called the Sunshine Law. And in general, if you want to know what your legislators are doing, you can simply submit a public request and they have to give you that information. There are some exemptions in the Sunshine Law. So if you ask information about redistricting, that is excluded from the Sunshine Law. So if I want to know what Simpson said to Bloor and Book in terms of the redistricting, I can ask, but they don't have to tell me, because that communication is exempt from the Sunshine Law. So there's a Senate and a House bill to try to eliminate that exemption from Florida law. I have to tell you, I don't think it's going to go anywhere, but it's something to keep in mind that would be a good thing to have maybe next year when things aren't so exciting. Next slide, please.
If we could.
So where are we? So committee meetings started in the summer, or got revved. Actually, they started convening in the fall. Things were starting warming up in the summer, and so I'll have to say that in the warm up, the Rodriguez, who's in charge of the Senate committee, was saying all the right things, and I'll have to admit I was somewhat cynical about it, but he has really made an effort, at least in public, and I think sincerely, to have the process be as legitimate as possible. He apparently was around or was somehow involved 10 years ago, and the Florida legislature was just excoriated. I think that's the right word. I mean, the judge in the case, I mean, was just blasted them for their overt partisanship. And so he said, we're not going to go through that again. So he has, at least in public, made a lot of statements about following the laws, and has really, sent memos to his group and so on and so forth. So I have to give him credit for that. So the session started in January 11th, and will continue until the middle of March. And it's expected that all 3 of the maps will be completed during that time period, the process I just described a minute ago. So the Senate released a lot of maps before the session began. So the first week of session, they had a committee meeting, and they picked out a couple of the maps that they liked. And then last week, they selected the 2 maps that they liked. So now we're talking about their version of the congressional map and their Senate map. And we're expecting today, 3:30 to 5:30, that they're going to present their chosen map to the full Senate, their chosen maps to the full Senate. And we're anticipating that those maps will be approved by the Senate as a whole. So the Senate, again, assuming that nothing's changed from yesterday to today, that the Senate map that I think will be approved by the Senate is 8058. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then as far as we know, again, everything being normal, which it may not be, that will be, I suppose, submitted to the Attorney General and then submitted to the Supreme Court for review. The congressional map, as I said, will I guess sit on the shelf until the House passes their maps. The House has released some maps, but they're not making progress. Now, in fairness, the Senate has 40 seats and the House has 120 districts. So you might want to give them some slack. They had a meeting scheduled today, I think it was today or maybe yesterday, and they canceled it because of the issue that we're speculating that because of the issue I'm going to cover at the very end. So let's go to the next slide, please. So we're lucky to be in Florida. Sometimes, at least in this regard, we're lucky that we have an active League of Women Voters. So pat yourself on the back, because in 2010, the League of Women Voters passed what were called the Fair District Amendments. And those are really, really important. And we could never get them passed now because so many changes have been made. But it's that in the Constitution, we have guardrails to protect us against gerrymandering. So the way that they always describe these conditions that govern the redistricting process, it's called Tier 1, and Tier 1 has to be obeyed. It has to be a criteria that is used to determine the districts. So it says no district shall be drawn with a notice that says the intent to favor, or I can't read the last word on there, but favor or, whatever, a political party or an incumbent. So notice that it says intent though. And that's where we go back to that question about would the communication being privileged, so that if you know, if Jeff and Robin are communicating and talking about, well, you know, my cousin wants to run for office in such, you know, in Sarasota, so why don't you blah, blah, blah. We can't see that communication. So I'm not saying that is happening. I'm just saying if it were, we couldn't see it because that is exempt. So the intention, last time they were able to actually get a lot of emails that showed nefarious activity. They probably have learned their lesson. Maybe at least that those emails won't be available. And also really important, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this toward the end, the district shall not be drawn with the intent or result. So now this is really good. The intent or result of denying or abridging the equal opportunity of racial or language minorities to participate in the political process or to diminish their ability to elect representatives of their choice. That is really strong language. The other tier 1 criteria is that the districts have to consist of contiguous territory. So you can't have like 2 little bunches, you know, they have to actually run together. Next slide, please. Then there's tier 2 criteria, which is a secondary consideration, and sort of as they try to do it as much as possible, but they have to do tier 1. So they want the sizes in each district to be about the same. They should try to make them as compact as possible, and then to follow existing political and geographic boundaries. So now the congressional map, now we're going to talk about the congressional map, which, as I say, is still, I mean, they've, I think, agreed, or at least I'll expect that to find out tomorrow that that's what they agreed to. It has to be negotiated with the House. As I said, that we've gone from 27 to 28 districts. As you might imagine, that additional district is seated in the middle of the state where all of the growth is. So the one drawn by the Senate is anchored in Polk County with portions in Lake and Sumter. So now we get to sort of the important parts, although you sort of have to have the background to get the important parts, at least I think so. So now we're going to look at the 2 criteria, the tier 1 criteria that help us decide whether these maps are good. Are they constitutionally compliant? So the congressional delegation, so when we send these people to our US House of Representatives, the map that's drawn, the Senate map, the congressional map drawn by the Senate, if you look at the voting history, you would say that probably we would end up electing 16 Republicans and 12 Democrats, which was really a surprise when these maps were released. Nobody expected this. People were so relieved because now there's 16 Republicans and 11 Democrats that are elected. So this was considered a huge relief, that people were really happy that they didn't really try to gerrymander it in the way that they had come to expect based on 10 years ago. Now, the minority districts, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, they preserved the minority districts that were established in the last map. So the last map was drawn really by the Florida Supreme Court, and it was considered constitutionally compliant because those amendments were in place at that point. So there were 4 Black and 4 Hispanic minority districts, and they made a huge deal about preserving those districts, that was really important to them. And they were really trying to be compliant with the requirement. Now talking about the Senate map, again, 40 seats in the Senate. They're anticipating that it was approved today. And again, little political controversy. People were very relieved with both of these maps, that if you, again, look at the voting history, you might expect that 23 districts, if you reconfigure them according to the revised maps, 23 districts probably would have voted for Trump, 13 for Biden. And then there's 4 competitive districts, and you can see in the parentheses how that compares to the current configuration of senators. And again, there are more seats, so there are currently 5 minority districts for Blacks and 5 minority districts for Hispanics. We are not happy about these maps because Alachua County is divided into 2 Senate districts. And we tried to get some interest going. I don't know if you saw the newspaper article that came out with the big picture of the map. Of course, most of us don't get the hard copy anymore. We tried to get some interest and some advocacy going to make that, to advocate to put us in one Senate district, but they moved so fast we didn't have a chance. We tried to get the city and the county, to work with us and try to bring some advocacy to this, but they just moved too fast. So that is probably going to be the case, that more or less Northern Alachua County and Southern Alachua County are going to be in 2 separate Senate districts, which really dilutes the power of Alachua County, which, as you know, votes quite differently than the surrounding counties. I don't think that was an accident, but given the totality of the map, we never would have been able to get any statewide pushback. Where the pushback is going to be with these 2 maps, well, this one anyway, because this is one that's settled, is on the minority districts. They're not going to talk about gerrymandering because it's a very small issue if anything happens. So at this point, the only thing that can happen would be, well, assuming that they get approved, would be litigation. So we're pretty much done with advocacy on that issue. Next slide, please. So the House maps, people are just throwing their hands up. They're not even talking about them specifically. They just say that they're highly gerrymandered, that they're really, completely in favor of the Republicans. They haven't even talked about minority rights. They've been widely criticized. As I said, they were supposed to have a meeting this week and they've canceled that meeting. So they're pretty much, I wouldn't say in disarray because I don't know enough about it, but they certainly are not presenting a very transparent front. That's sort of a polite way to say it, I guess. Next slide, please. And that's both the House map and the Congressional map. Anyway, so there are 2 sets of guidelines that protect minority voting rights in Florida. One is the Federal Voting Rights Act, which applies to all the states. And then the other, as I mentioned, is the Florida Constitution. And I'll just talk a little bit more about those 2 things. Jeff, next slide, please. So we know that the 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but obviously just saying it didn't make it so. We all know that the treatment of African Americans in America was abysmal, particularly in the South, and that included just the barriers to voting, which were just unconscionable and insulting and degrading. So finally, even though that was the amendment that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 gave legal protection. So now people could start suing. They could say, this process, this district, this blah, blah, this example, these are happening and they're taking them to court. And so that was the single biggest thing that has happened in America to advance the rights of minorities to have access to the vote. And it really was huge in terms of the turnaround and the progress. I'm not saying it solved everything. I'm just saying it really made a big difference. Next slide, please. The Florida Constitution also, as I mentioned earlier, not only protects minority rights, but the important thing, at least in my mind, is you don't have to prove intent. All you have to show is that that's the result. So that's really good because it's a lower standard of proof. So it prohibits the inability to register or interference with voting. And, probably you've tracked or you're aware of SB 90 that happened last year that started to put some restrictions on voting rights that perhaps disproportionately affected people of color. And the League of Women Voters and others are in fact engaged in litigation to to work on that specific issue in terms of voting access for people of color. So that was sort of last year's issue. The thing that's a little tricky, that's a little complicated, is you say, okay, well, minorities have the right to elect representatives of their choice. Well, like, what does that mean? How do you do that? It's really a complicated question. So there's two, so basically they create some districts that quite often you hear the term majority minority districts. And if in that case, the voters represent 50% or more, the minorities represent 50% of or more of the people who can vote in that block. That's pretty simple, minority, majority. But that you really is you can't do that very often. So then there's really what we're looking at is minority opportunity districts. And so in a minority opportunity district, you look at a high percent of minorities, and then you look at how they vote. So let's just say we have a high percent of Latinos, and they tend to vote Democratic. Well, and then it turns out that a lot of the white people in that vote in that district, or a lot of the other voters in that district, also vote Democratic. So that would be a minority opportunity district, because even though it's not 50%, it's close to 50%, but they live with people that vote like them. So that would be called a minority opportunity district. So now that's how you give minorities the opportunity to elect representatives of their choice. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that in the last redistricting process, we ended up with let's just take the Senate. We ended up with five minority districts for African Americans, 5 minority districts for Latinos. And so what the Senate is saying, well, we kept them, we got it. And so, but really what you're supposed to do, you're supposed to say, okay, how many minority districts do we need? Last time, they said we needed 5 of each. How do you know? Well, this is really complicated and I don't understand it very well. So don't ask me any questions because I'm telling you everything I know. So I can answer questions about other stuff though. So you do something, the step 1 is you do a racially polarized voting analysis. And so what minority groups are we thinking about? So in Florida, we have Latinos and African Americans. Then you look at the number of those populations that are in the voting aged people. How many voting age people are in that group? So they don't look at the registered voters. They look at the people who could be registered, or at least the people who are in that right age group. So again, that tells us, okay, so how many people, this is statewide analysis. And then they look at the voting history of the minority population, because then you have to think about, well, you got Latinos, but maybe the Cubans vote differently than the people from Puerto Rico. And so like who is a group, which minority, that sort of thing. Then they do some big statistical analysis, and that is supposed to give you the number of minority districts that you need. That's what they didn't do. So they just said, okay, we got 5 of each. That was what they're calling the baseline map. The baseline map was the map that was approved by the Supreme Court in 2015 after all the falderall. So you do a functional analysis. Now you look at the district and you make sure that they're a majority, minority, or the opportunity district. And so what they did is when they redistrict, they looked at those 5 and they made sure that the people in that the minorities in those groups could elect the representative of their choice. But they didn't go back and figure out how many they should have. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Diane, pardon me. when you say they, are we talking about the House?
So the only thing that we know, we only know what the Senate has done. The Senate is the only one that has addressed this. So the House has been silent. So that's the answer. So there's a staff guy. I mean, he goes through these maps. I mean, he's like really a nerdy guy, right? He like knows all this stuff. I don't know if they know how to do this analysis though, because they don't talk about that. They just talk about the functional analysis because they understand that. Okay, so again, this is just go back and say the same thing that I think I already said, so that the congressional map and the Senate maps that have been proposed by the Senate maintain the minority opportunity districts that were established by the baseline maps. And they are really proud of that. They keep talking about that. But if you, okay, remember we got another representative. So we got 2.74 million more people in 2020 than we had in 2010. And 90% of those people were non-white. I mean, you could split hairs and say Hispanics or Latinos or white, but I think they divide them up, by Hispanic and white. I think they divide those into two separate categories. So 90% of those people were non-white. Next slide, please. So this is just a specific, the specific information. So the population increase of the column on the left shows the percent of increase from 2010 to 2020. And so although Asians increased a lot, there weren't very many to begin with. So that 41% is a little misleading because you see, even now, they're only 3% of the population. But the big increase was in Latinos. Of course, we had those hurricanes in Puerto Rico. So we know we have a lot of new Puerto Ricans and they're all citizens. So anyway, so the total percent of the population, the column on the right, Florida's still a majority white state, but the white percent is decreasing. I think last time it was 54%. So it's a lower white percentage. The percentage of Blacks in the population, 15, and the percentage of Latino is 27. So that seems to be really, and what all the advocates are saying now is that we have a lot more minorities. We really need to look at how many minority opportunity districts we should have. And there's incredible pushback on that. This, as I say, the Senate map is probably going to be approved today with the five that were in there. Next slide, please. So over the weekend, you may have heard about this. Over the weekend, the governor's general counsel released a new map. And he stated that it was because they had legal concerns about the congressional map. And of course, they're specifically, I think, talking about the Senate map, because the Senate map was very reasonable, except for Alachua County, but that was very reasonable from a political standpoint, not so great on the minority issue standpoint, but from a political standpoint, it was pretty solid. But he's saying, well, they have legal concerns about the Senate drawn map, and they're claiming that their map adheres to federal and state requirements, increases compactness, because, like if it's, like that, it's not so great. If it's like that, it's better. I don't know if you can see my hands, but you know what I'm talking about. The closer to a circle it is, that's gets you some brownie points, I guess. And they claim that it protects minority populations better. So if you listen to the next sentence, and it implies that they want to be sure that they get that they're transparent. I'm starting to hate that word, that they're transparent about their concerns about the map, because they want to be sure that everybody understands where the governor stands in case he has to veto these maps, because the governor has to approve the congressional maps. So the map that the governor released, there's the guy's name, I forget, Newland or something, but anyway, it's the governor's map. So they're like, we got 5 Hispanic districts. And of course you saw that big increase in Hispanic population, right? So they're like, we got 5 Hispanic districts instead of 4. Well, these guys are really amazing. These like guys that can look at these maps that have all this experience. I mean, I'm so impressed. A map comes out. I mean, the next day they can tell you all about it. I'm so impressed. But anyway, they said, yeah, okay. So they got maps with a lot of Hispanics in them, but it just so happens a lot of the Hispanics in those districts are not legally able to vote. So that was really smart, right? Because there are a lot of Hispanics there, but these guys are really sharp, right? They said a lot of them aren't going to be able to vote. And so you look at the voting age population of Hispanics, but if you get a lot of people who can't vote, that really skews the whole purpose of that definition. And oh my God, can you believe it? I'm sorry, I'm so into this. They reduced African-American districts from 4 to 2. Go figure. I mean, how could that's just so blatant. And it increases the advantage for Republicans so that they would get somewhere between 18 and 20 seats in the House. I mean, I mean, well, so, I mean, the speculation, of course, is that, you know, he's going to be running for president and, you know, he is just, so the question everybody's asking is like, really, is this just something that he's doing for publicity for his base that he can say he tried? We'll see. The Senate, as far as we know, has scheduled their meeting. As far as we know, they started voting they finished their voting as this meeting ended. So if they don't approve that congressional map, I'll send it to Jeff and we'll give you an update. But we think that they're going to go forward. This Rodriguez was really adamant. We are not making the same mistakes again. So I'm hoping that they'll push this map forward. Of course, you know, the governor has to approve it. Anyway, so I encourage you to give testimony. So there's a website that they set up, and you can go to this website. You can click on this link and you'll go to a page and it says, you know, what's your name? Where do you live? Of course, they want to, you know your address and all this stuff. One of the questions is, who did you talk to? You can say the Legal Voters of Alachua County. You can put my name, but really I'm here as a league person. So that would be what I would put in, the Legal Voters of Alachua County. And then you can select a map, or you can just make some general comments. But the comments that you know, they said it's a done deal that the Senate, that Alachua County is going to be divided into 2, and probably nobody's going to take that up. They said that it's important to testify, because if there are lawsuits, this testimony that's submitted by the population could be part of the evidence that they would bring forward. So I would think that we would want to talk about, because I've already gone on and put in information about Alachua County, but now I have to go back and talk about, so you could talk about the governor's map and say that you thought, you think that it's, not appropriate, that it's not compliant with tier 1 criteria. You could say something really fancy like that. Or you could say that that you think that that we need to have, a better consideration of the higher numbers of minorities, and we should have a reevaluation of the minority districts. So just a couple sentences. It doesn't need to be elaborate. It doesn't need to be fancy. It doesn't need to be highly technical. I love that language though, like, like tier 1 compliant. I thought that sounded really fancy, but you don't have to say that. You could just say anything you want. Just to say something about the maps that you as a citizen, you don't think that they represent you as a citizen, what you think is important in terms of who can vote for whom. So important. So you could write a letter to the editor. We already put in one op-ed a couple of months ago that talked about transparency. The article on minority rights that we just talked about will go in, maybe some tweaks with some of these updates will go in the first Sunday of February. So we already have 2 op-eds. If anybody's feeling really ambitious, but I think, you know, that the iguana, I think it's too late to get anything in there. Talk to your friends, talk to your relatives, talk to your colleagues. The more people go on and testify, I mean, you know, I don't know how much it's going to help, but it's not going to take a very long time, and it might help because these people are getting ready to file lawsuits. So they have to decide whether they, you know, we have to wait until the process plays out, but we want to give them all the help that we can. Because that's really all we can do. And, you know, talk to your friends, talk to your churches. If you know, you can get the articles if you want, like if you got a little newsletter for your whatever. I mean, I'm certainly glad to write a little spiel. And I think that's the last slide, Jeff.